Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives 4 Symphony. And in this video, we're going to talk about the very special sauce that makes this edition seaworthy, and that's the real-world feedback project that informs so much of the editorial work that was done after 2011. In 2011, I had finished up the desk work that I had done on the edition, meaning all the work I had done in the abstract, editing the materials, setting them, and going over all the pages of the score and the parts and crafting the forward and all that. But I realized that I needed to go and watch these materials be put to use to see if things worked correctly and if there were bugs, and to figure out how to get the bugs out and so on. And it turned out that there were 3 performances scheduled of it in 1 month, in 1 month's time. And those performances were at the Lucerne Festival in 2012 in late August. And then 2 weeks later, the Berlin Philharmonic was doing it. And the week following that, the Concertgebouw was doing it. And I thought, well, I need to go and be present for all 3 of these things and see how they go. And I did. And so much came out of the woodwork that I realized, okay, I need to keep doing this, because each conductor who tackles the score brings to it a particular perspective with a particular agenda as to how the piece should be rendered. And then they're being confronted by all of the minutiae that had been covered up in the past in the 65 score that have been unearthed and made clear, so that now there can be a lot of really interesting informed choices in how the thing can be rendered, right? And so the number of things that can be done with the piece had increased exponentially. And there's no amount of editorial guessing that you can do from a desk that will let you know whether or not something actually works until you actually see it be put to true use, and then interact with the musicians to find out what's working and what's not. And that's precisely what I did. This edition is informed by the direct feedback I got from conductors, plural, orchestra members, stagehands, orchestra librarians, everyone who's involved with a production of this behemoth. And it had just for example, like the forward grew from 17 pages to 43 pages over 5 years. And the number of minutiae and the parts that had to be attended to was just extraordinary. So we're going to start with a few simple but interesting examples of this in this video, and the videos that follow will branch off from this, and we'll always touch on the real world feedback that I got. So let's go right into it. So here we're looking at the part for the chorus, which is just called Voices, because that's what Ives called it. In its initial incarnation, the cover to the part was blank, just as you see here. Now, after that comes the first page of the music proper, where the voices enter. Now, the premiere of the edition was at the Lucerne Festival in Switzerland in 2012, and a local choir from Lucerne was employed. Importantly, the native language of the choir members was likely German, not English. Unsurprisingly, many of the singers had trouble with some of the English words in the hymn, most notably promise, which they pronounced promise, or at least some of them did and others didn't. In the performance, you could hear sort of a mixture of the 2 pronunciations coming from the choir when they got to that word. It hadn't occurred to me at my editorial desk that foreign language choirs would have that much difficulty pronouncing the English text. And so this is a perfect example of the understandable oversight you can make outside of witnessing a real-world use of the materials. Now, I knew there had to be a way to safeguard the hymn text against this kind of mistake in the future. And there was, and there is, IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, which all singers know. So the solution here was really easy. I added an IPA transliteration of the lyrics of the Watchman hymn to the cover of the part and added a paragraph about it to the survival guide in the score. And that took care of it. Never again did I encounter choruses mispronouncing words. Now, there's some debate about the pronunciation of the word Israel in the hymn. Is it Israel or Israel? In the British tradition, it's Israel. But there's an American tradition of singing Israel, and most recordings of the symphony prior to the new edition employ Israel. For example, Margaret Hillis and the Chicago Symphony under Michael Tilson Thomas in that 1987 recording. Now, because of that, and because Ives is American, I decided to use that pronunciation in the IPA, but I wanted to document it in case anyone thought I didn't know about the competing pronunciations. So I draw attention to it with this note here, just to let the reader know that it's an editorial choice. Another thing to mention is that there wasn't an accompaniment for rehearsal purposes in the first version of the choral part. After the first 3 performances, I added one in, and it's helped choirs ever since, especially with the 4th movement. Okay, these are really simple things. There are far more complex problems that came up, ones that are not so obvious. So let's turn to another one involving text first. This is going to contrast with the issue with the Watchman hymn text, but in this case, the language wasn't the issue, but the culture was. Okay, here's the Indian drum part, which is coupled with the piccolo timpano part. One player covers both instruments. Now, that actually turns out to be a problem, but we'll return to that in a bit. Notice the first page is blank. This is how it appeared in the first iteration of the parts, just like the blank cover of the choral part. Now, in the initial performances, all manner of instruments were being used for the Indian drum. A true Indian drum wasn't always being used, and so I realized the instrument itself needed to be described and a representative instrument suggested. So, as with the cover of the choral part, the cover of the Indian drum part was the likely place to spell it out and provide an official definition of the Indian drum. This would ensure the players would see it, read it, and find an actual Indian drum and use it for performances. So, starting with about the 5th performance I attended, the cover was revised to have this text, which quotes from Andrew Stiller's authoritative handbook of instrumentation. In it, he writes, "The Indian drum is a double-headed drum without raised rims. More important, the heads are quite loose and are attached to the shell by tacks or lashings, making the drum difficult, if not impossible, to tune. The drum is usually small and less deep than wide. Despite that, it is typically as low in pitch as the tenor drum, or lower, because of the looseness of the head. The sound of the drum is dark and tubby with a rapid decay." So, that describes how the instrument is constructed and how it should sound. Following that, I provided a suggestion as to what ready-made instrument would be appropriate: a small to medium powwow drum, right? Starting in the spring of 2013, players had the revised cover, and they began using actual Indian drums in the rehearsals and performances they attended. This seemed to solve the problem, and I thought everything was fine, but I was wrong. I discovered this in 2015, but not with an orchestra whose native language was not English, but rather an orchestra whose native language was English, and yet there was a problem with interpreting the text. It came about when I attended rehearsals by the BBC Symphony in September of 2015. During the rehearsals, I noticed the Indian drum player did not seem to be using a true Indian drum. So I approached him during the break and I said, "Hey, what kind of instrument is that?" And he said, "Well, it's an Indian drum." And I looked on his stand and I saw that he did in fact have the revised part with the definition on the cover. So I asked him, "Does it really conform to that text on the cover?" He answered, "Oh yeah, you can see the instrument is exactly like it's described. It's a tabla." And my heart dropped. I realized, oh my goodness, there's been another misunderstanding. But this time, the issue isn't a language barrier, it's a cultural barrier. To anyone in England, Indian means the Indian subcontinent, not Native American Indian. So, of course, he was going to be confused by the name of the instrument, and then the description, which could in fact describe a tabla. So I said, well, wait, I wrote down at the bottom of the note on the cover that a powwow drum was probably the right instrument to use. And then he surprised me again. He looked at me and he gave me this blank stare and he said, "What's a powwow?" And again, anyone in North America would know what a powwow is, but very few people across the Atlantic would. So again, this was a cultural barrier that prevented understanding, not a language barrier. So I realized the note on the cover needed to be revised again to safeguard against cultural misinterpretation. It now begins with this paragraph. Firstly, Ives is referencing a Native American Indian drum, not an Asian Indian drum. So a tabla would be incorrect, but a powwow drum would be appropriate. And then the rest of the note is exactly as it was before. This seems to have solved the problem. There have been no issues with incorrect instruments being used for this part, and the rehearsals and performances I've witnessed ever since. Now, about the piccolo timpano doubling. When the Seattle Symphony performed this edition in January of 2015, the percussionist alerted me to an issue that had slipped through the cracks and had never been mentioned to me before. The part states that the Indian drum player in the second movement is to play the piccolo timpano in the fourth movement. But remember, there's an Indian drum in the BU ensemble in the fourth movement also, and the same player is likely going to perform both parts. So that player will leave the stage after playing the Indian drum in the second movement to move to the location of the BU ensemble to play the Indian drum with that group. If that's the case, then there will be no one left on stage to cover the piccolo timpano part in the fourth movement. No other orchestra had brought this up to me. So we scratched our heads, and then we realized that if you have someone playing the optional xylophone part in the second movement, which they did, then that player could cover the piccolo timpano on stage during the fourth movement. So there needed to be text added to the cover of the part explaining this problem and also proposing a solution. Hence, I crafted this note at the top explaining how to solve this instrument staffing problem. Again, this was something I'd never have realized had I not been there to interact with the players and discover the problem, and then to work out a good solution with their direct involvement. So you see how these little problems can slip past you if you're just looking at the materials on your desk as an editor. They only truly manifest in full and come to life when you're there on site, interacting with musicians and watching rehearsals take place, and seeing with your own eyes what's going right and what's not. It's from this very kind of real-world feedback that this edition has been made seaworthy. I'm very proud of this, and yet it's nothing that's explained in the foreword of the published edition. I wish I had explained it there, but I didn't, and that's part of why I'm doing these videos. I want people to know about this very special journey that I took with the edition and how the edition was refined by direct observation of its use, and with direct feedback from conductors, musicians, orchestra librarians, and even stagehands. I'm not sure there's any other piece of music that would require someone to travel so far and over so many years to collect this kind of feedback to safeguard it, but it's certainly the case that it's necessary for the Ives Fourth. So this video is the first where I'm explicitly referencing the real-world feedback. It's actually incorporated in the videos prior to this one, but those deal with specific issues in the score and parts. The videos that follow provide helpful information for interpreters of the work, both performers and musicians, so they'll help the viewer understand otherwise tricky aspects of the piece. But in the process, the videos document the interesting experiences I had with the edition as I followed it from orchestra to orchestra, refining it along the way.